Hi guys, welcome to a video, and in today's video we're just going to be doing a deep dive into the lesbian media of the 90s. The BC era, before Shaken. I thought the lesbians who are watching this might appreciate that. Did you appreciate it? Let me know down in the comments. You better have done. A quick thank you to my members for supporting this video by supplying me with coffee. I am old, and that is how these videos get made. They make me feel so loved, they make me feel... Thank you. So, before we look at the on-screen lesbian media of the 90s, it's worth discussing the socio-political and legal landscape regarding lesbians and same-sex relationships within that period, to better understand why the growing presence of on-screen lesbian visibility in the 90s was so significant, and the role it played in shaping society's perceptions of homosexuality for the better. Now, this is a really interesting time for on-screen lesbian and bisexual representation, because the 90s were a time where attitudes towards and perceptions of gay and lesbian populations, particularly in the West, were rapidly changing. The 90s saw queer theory established in the academic world, where it encouraged discourse that challenged the idea of heterosexuality and gender conformity as the accepted norm in society. But most importantly, in 1992, the World Health Organization removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. And this was fundamental to the change in societal attitudes towards homosexuality, because it was now no longer officially regarded as a mental disorder. And that removal helped to diminish the negative connotations surrounding same-sex attraction. So many gay men and lesbians had been, and still are today unfortunately, subjected to conversion therapy and damaging treatments as a result of that listing that was first created in 1968. So the removal of it in the 90s not only removed some of the stigma attached to same-sex attraction, but it also improved the mental and physical well-being and self-image of same-sex attracted women and men. In terms of gay and lesbian rights, the 90s were a period where gay and lesbian populations faced a lot of legal oppression and inequality. Same-sex marriage was not legal, and lesbians and gay men also had no legal protections in terms of employment and housing discrimination. Not only could you be denied employment for being same-sex attracted, but regardless of your sexuality, you could lose your job from vocalizing your support of same-sex relationships. One example of this is Section 28, a series of laws introduced here in the UK in 1988, which continue to be enforced all throughout the 90s. Section 28 prohibited teachers and local authorities from promoting homosexuality or suggesting that it is in any way acceptable or normal to be gay or lesbian, effectively attempting to erase homosexuality from children and young people's consciousness, and if it was mentioned, to reinforce the notion that it was immoral and shameful. It was a common belief in the 90s, and still is today, although less so, that children being exposed to gay and lesbian relationships would influence those children in becoming gay or lesbian themselves. And of course, with the historic erasure and deplatforming of gay men and lesbians unable to voice their own truth and their own narrative, combined with the lack of education and understanding about what it is to be gay or lesbian, it was difficult to combat the misinformation and prejudice that was being pushed by the government and by certain groups, which created such a vicious circle of silence and shame for so many years. Another example of the enforced culture of silence and shame around homosexuality during the 90s was the introduction of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. In 1993, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was instituted in the US military, which permitted gay people to serve but banned them from being openly gay while serving. So again, similar to Section 28, it's the attempt to hide away same-sex relationships in the public sphere and reinforce the notion that they're hidden away because they're distasteful, immoral, and so on. As well as Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the Defense of Marriage Act was also enacted in 1996 in the US, which defined marriage at the federal level as the union between one man and one woman, leaving both gay people and Mormons shaking in their boots. The Defense of Marriage Act was primarily brought about by a fear that if states granted same-sex couples the right to marry, the federal government and other states would have to honour those marriages. And of course, not being able to marry impacted gay and lesbian couples negatively in terms of things like taxes, inheritance, and in some cases not having access to their sick partner in hospital. So we can see the legal inequality concerning gay and lesbian populations and how the legal steps that were taken to try and erase visibility of same-sex relationships and conversations surrounding them, particularly in the public sphere, sent out a very clear and hostile message that said to gay and lesbian individuals who they are is something that should be hidden away. Who they are has no place in polite society. Who they are is distasteful, and who they are is less than. That said, looking back at the 90s, we can see just how far we've come in terms of gay and lesbian rights since then. And it's not only interesting to look back on things legally from that period, but it's also interesting to look back on art and media from that period, because art is so often a reflection of the socio-political landscape of the time in which it was created. So the boom of lesbian media in the 90s reflected a huge cultural shift taking place in regards to the perceptions of lesbianism and of same-sex attraction. And given how hostile the social and legal landscape was for lesbians, you begin to understand how monumental a thing it was for lesbians to be visible and try and garner social acceptance within that period, despite all the disdain from the prejudices people had learned being thrown at them. The only way to change the social landscape was to begin offering positive representation of lesbianism as an alternative to the negative ones. And in order to do that, lesbians had to put themselves out there on a platform and be able to bear the brunt of the backlash, which might cost them their job, their social standing, and in extreme cases, their physical and mental health. As I said earlier, it was a vicious cycle that had kept lesbians trapped in shame and silence for so many years. And this is really the reason why the on-screen lesbian representation in the 90s is so crucial and interesting to deconstruct, because it broke free of that cycle despite intense backlash and censorship. And that breaking free was pivotal to the progression of gay and lesbian rights. Now, on-screen lesbian media was of course being produced long before the 90s. However, up until the 90s, intersectionality within that media was practically non-existent. And a further example in which the 90s is a defining decade for on-screen lesbian representation is the rise of marginalised lesbian voices finding a platform in which they could finally share their experiences of navigating their intersectional identities within the lesbian community as well as wider society. This exposed audiences to narratives and perspectives which had either previously been dismissed or exploited and distorted by creators outside of that marginalised group. Another interesting observation about lesbian media in the 90s is the exploitation of lesbianism that had previously been utilised in cinema to gain publicity and to maximise ticket sales, started to be utilised on television for things such as ratings and again publicity. So you have these two types of lesbian representation in the media, motivated by very different things being produced alongside one another. One type motivated by lesbian and bisexual creators, trying to voice their experiences and shape a more authentic narrative and perception of lesbianism, and the other type motivated by exploitation and catering to the male gaze. Ah yes, the dual nature of lesbian media, it's tale as old as time. Yes. Alright, so with all of that in mind, let's take a look at some of the lesbian media which made up the lesbian boom of the 90s. The first piece of lesbian media we're going to be looking at from the 90s is the Puppy episode from the 4th season of the television series Ellen, which originally aired on ABC on the 30th of April 1997. And it was the highest rated episode of Ellen ever, drawing around 42 million viewers. The two-part episode details the lead character Ellen Morgan's realization that she is a lesbian, and the coming out arc of Ellen Morgan was huge for the 90s. The cultural impact that this episode had cannot be understated. Over 40 million people were exposed to a character coming out as a lesbian in a period where lesbianism was still largely rendered invisible in the mainstream media. Despite how successful the episode was, it also resulted in advertisers pulling out from the show, alongside bomb threats being aimed at the studio for airing it. And although the show was renewed for a 5th season, ABC prefaced each episode of that season with a parental advisory message due to the gay content, something that it didn't do for heterosexual content of a similar nature. Alongside the character of Ellen Morgan coming out, Ellen DeGeneres herself also officially came out in Time magazine, which was published on the 14th of April 1997. And the cultural significance of this was enormous, because someone as famous as Ellen coming out as gay challenged a lot of people's preconceived notions and provoked a number of conversations around gay and lesbian rights. It also provided the public with a much-needed source of lesbian visibility. Ellen's coming out was also an incredible risk that could have meant the death of her career, which is another reason that her taking that step was so courageous. However, even though her career survived, and in fact eventually thrived, that initial period after her coming out was very difficult, and Ellen was subjected to a lot of backlash and hostility. Alongside that, Laura Dern, who played the character of Susan on Ellen, said she didn't work for a year and a half because of her role on the show, which was a horrifying example of how much coming out not only affected gay and lesbian actors, but straight actors who were either associated with homosexuality or who played gay characters. To give you an idea of how huge Ellen's coming out was, a 2015 study commissioned by Variety found that Ellen DeGeneres influenced public opinion and acceptance about gay rights more than any other public figure. So the cultural impact and significance of Ellen's coming out episode, broadcasted to over 40 million people, cannot be understated, and her bravery and courage in speaking her truth during a time where people had very misguided and hostile notions about lesbians is a defining moment, if not the defining moment, for lesbian media and representation in the 90s. The 90s also broke new ground in lesbian representation with the rise of lesbian intimacy on television shows. In 1991, the first ever lesbian kiss was broadcast in the USA on the show LA Law in Season 5, Episode 12, titled He's a Crowd. Now, some people argue that the first kiss was actually broadcast in 1990 on a show called 21 Jump Street. But the shot of the kiss in 21 Jump Street didn't show the actual kiss. It only showed the top half of their faces. So I would say it's worth mentioning, but since the kiss was censored, in my opinion, LA Law was the first. Michelle Green, who played the character of Abby on LA Law, later told After Ellen that the kiss had been included for ratings and that there had never been a plan to explore their relationship, which is an insight into how lesbianism was beginning to be utilised for publicity and profit on television, and rather those were the motivations for including it in some cases, rather than an attempt to portray positive or authentic lesbian representation. After the lesbian kiss in LA Law aired, lesbian kisses began appearing more frequently in US television throughout the 90s, on shows such as Picket Fences in 1993, Rosanne Rosanne in 1994. In fact, Rosanne is an interesting one because it was one of the first shows to introduce a recurring bisexual character, played by Sandra Bernhard. And as a not-so-fun fact, ABC didn't want to air the episode with the lesbian kiss. But because Roseanne Barr threatened to take her sitcom to another network, ABC obliged, but included a parental advisory warning on it. And for that episode of Roseanne, 30 million viewers tuned in. So again, we can see with that number alone, the amount of public interest and attention that lesbian intimacy garnered in this period, why it was utilised for that purpose on television. There were also lesbian kisses in Star Trek Deep Space Nine in 1995, Party of Five in 1999, and in Ally McBeal, also in 1999. The rise of on-screen lesbian intimacy was not just confined to the USA. The 90s also saw the UK broadcast the first lesbian kiss to be shown on television before the 9 p.m. watershed in 1994. The kiss was between the characters of Beth and Margaret on the Channel 4 soap opera Brookside, and it was a huge deal because the kiss could potentially be seen by a younger audience. And this was during a time where Section 28 was still enforced throughout schools. So this kiss is one of the most iconic lesbian kisses of the 90s because of the fact that it was pre-watershed. It's a common misconception that the lesbian kiss on Brookside in 1994 was the first ever on-screen lesbian kiss in the UK. But in fact, the very first kiss happened 20 years earlier in 1974 on a show called Girl, between the characters of Chrissy and Jackie. At the time, the kiss was considered so controversial that the producer of the show came to watch rehearsals to make sure things didn't go too far. And the broadcast of that episode was also preceded by a special announcement warning viewers of the content. Other examples of on-screen lesbian representation in the 90s appeared on UK television in series such as Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, which aired in 1990, and Bad Girls, which began airing in 1999. Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit was an on-screen adaptation of a very famous novel of the same name, and it explored a working-class lesbian narrative, making it one of the few but important examples of intersectionality within 90s lesbian media. It was also the first series to broadcast a lesbian love scene in the UK, and it drew in an audience of 6 million viewers. However, even though a lot of the lesbian elements were diluted for the series, it still caused a lot of controversy and outrage, both before and after it aired. Bad Girls was a series about a women's prison which portrayed a relationship between the characters of Helen and Nikki, and their relationship was fairly explicit in comparison to previous depictions of lesbian relationships on UK television. This is largely because it was produced at the end of the 90s and benefited from the changing perceptions of lesbian relationships that had occurred throughout the decade. A notable fun connection between these two series is, in the first season of Bad Girls, Nikki actually hands Helen a copy of Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit in the prison library. We've come full circle. Alongside the USA and UK, Israel and the Netherlands also saw their first on-screen lesbian kisses in the television shows Florentine, which aired in Israel in 1997, and the first season of Blauwe Vlegel, which aired in the Netherlands in 1993. So you can see how lesbian visibility and representation was beginning to take shape on mainstream television around the world to millions of viewers at a time, which had an incredible impact on society in terms of humanizing lesbian populations and challenging the prejudices that surrounded them. Even a television show as huge and mainstream as Friends featured a lesbian couple, and although no intimacy was shown on screen between them, their presence on the show alone is very telling of the changing cultural landscape of the 90s. But without a doubt, the most iconic on-screen lesbian representation to come from the 90s and perhaps of all time is unquestionably Zena and Gabrielle from Xena Warrior Princess, a series which started airing in 1995 and spanned 6 seasons, following the character of Zena, an infamous warrior on a quest to seek redemption for her past sins, alongside the small-town bard Gabrielle. It's no secret that the writers for Zena purposely implemented romantic subtext between the characters of Zena and Gabrielle from the very beginning, and this subtext eventually bled into main text in the later seasons. Zena and Gabrielle were declared soulmates, they kissed on the lips more than once, and they even got married. It's also been confirmed by the creator of Zena, Rob Tappert, in numerous interviews that the romantic relationship between the two was deliberate and carefully planted in the show. But he and the writers had to contend with the censors, meaning that they were limited with what they could portray on screen. Tappert has also said that they had written an episode where they actually outed Zena and Gabrielle, but Universal told them that they couldn't use it, so they ended up having to do a rewrite. The show, at its core, is a piece of lesbian media, but it's a piece that's distorted by performative heterosexual elements for the sake of keeping the studio happy and to keep it marketable to as big an audience as possible. It's been well documented that the writers faced a lot of barriers with the network, desperately trying to censor any overt romantic implications between Zena and Gabrielle. However, the writers' creative efforts to get around the censorship, alongside the lightning in a bottle chemistry that Lucy and Renee had, undoubtedly created one of the most iconic lesbian couples of all time. Xena Warrior Princess is an example of lesbian representation that managed to thrive against censorship, and it was a lifeline for a lot of lesbians and bisexual women in the 90s who struggled to see that type of relationship and love between two women anywhere else. It really is a special show, and alongside Ellen, is absolutely one of the most defining pieces of lesbian media from the 90s. And of course, it was not just the Western world that provided lesbian and bisexual representation. We also have the explosion of Yuri in the 90s, a genre of Japanese media focusing on intimate relationships between female characters, which was produced mostly by female creators and imported all around the world, providing an important source of lesbian representation during a time when it was still very much scarce. Up until the 90s, lesbian relationships in Yuri productions were often intertwined with tragedy, with the lesbian couple either being separated or one half of the couple dying. But by the 90s, those kinds of negative portrayals had declined in popularity, and instead there was a rise in lesbian relationships being portrayed in a much more positive and healthy way. Part of this positive change is due to the success of Sailor Moon, a Japanese manga-turned-anime series written and illustrated by Naoko Takeuchi. Sailor Moon rapidly gained worldwide success, and the series was not only female-centric, but it also portrayed lesbian, bisexual, and gender non-conforming female characters in a positive light, including the lesbian couple of Sailor Uranus and Sailor Neptune. And the success of Sailor Moon had a direct influence on the Yuri that was being created in the 90s. By the end of the decade, other productions containing positive lesbian representation, such as Revolutionary Girl Utena and Maria Watches Over Us, also saw a level of success, reflecting changing attitudes towards lesbianism in Japan during this period, as well as the West. However, interestingly, the sapphic aspects of Sailor Moon in the Japanese anime were censored in the English dubbed version. For example, in the English dubbed version, they made Sailor Uranus and Sailor Neptune cousins instead of romantic partners. They changed the character of Zoisite from a gay man to a straight female, and also censored any overtly gender non-conforming characters, which, considering that both versions of the anime were aimed at younger audiences, highlights a stark contrast between the social perceptions of lesbian relationships in Japan and the West during the 90s. And finally, the 90s also saw a boom in lesbian and sapphic themed cinema. And it was a particularly interesting time for lesbian cinema because throughout the decade there was a rise of independent films gaining success not only through the film festival circuit, but but at the box office as well. This meant queer independent female creators had more freedom and opportunities to express their own narratives on screen, and changed the landscape of lesbian cinema, directing it away from a lot of the negative portrayals and tropes that had taken root there in previous decades. Lesbian cinema has been produced since the early 20th century, but up until around the 1980s, it was either heavily censored, intertwined with negative tropes, or a product of male exploitation. So, with new creative opportunities in the 90s for female creators who had previously struggled to find a platform, combined with a changing social climate, lesbian cinema in the 90s became much more expansive and intersectional, offering more variety and a newfound sense of authenticity. The biggest example of the rise of intersectionality in on-screen lesbian media in the 90s was undoubtedly the release of The Watermelon Woman in 1996. It was the first ever film to feature a black lesbian lead, and the first ever feature film directed by a black lesbian, Cheryl Dunye. Considering that lesbian cinema had been in production since the 1930s, and The Watermelon Woman was not produced until 1996, it highlights just how marginalized black women, particularly black lesbians, were and unfortunately still are today in the film industry. Cheryl Dunye herself has said, "I did the research, I did look in black film history and found nothing but homophobia and omission. I did look at queer film history, I read Vito Russell, found no mention of race. So I hope that my film spurs these younger people to think about their identities within the context of representation in the media." The Watermelon Woman was not the first film to feature black lesbian characters on screen. However, films such as The Color Purple and She's Gotta Have It, both released in the 80s, were directed by men, which obscured and distorted the representation of black lesbian women, particularly in She's Gotta Have It, where the lesbian character is portrayed as disdainful of men and is largely a projection of male perceptions of female homosexuality. And in The Color Purple, it was practically erased altogether. So The Watermelon Woman is significant in that it represents black lesbian women finally gaining a platform on which to voice their own experiences, shape their own narratives, and more importantly, capitalize upon that themselves. If we take a look at the type of films being produced during the 90s, we can see that the decade offers a rich variety of sapphic representation in cinema, which makes up a significant part of the lesbian boom. In 1991, we have Fried Green Tomatoes, an on-screen adaptation of the book of the same name. Largely considered to be a lesbian film due to the heavy subtext around Ruth and Iggy's relationship, the chemistry between the two characters, and the portrayal of Iggy as a gender non-conforming woman. Alongside this, the book which the film is based upon explicitly states that Ruth and Iggy were in love, as well as the author Fanny Flagg being a lesbian herself, all of which further contributes to the sapphic associations of the film. Fried Green Tomatoes was incredibly successful in the 90s. It was even nominated for an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay, and it portrayed the suggestively romantic relationship between Ruth and Iggy in a tender and sympathetic way, making the film a ray of light and a positive contribution to the lesbian cinematic landscape of the 90s. Then in 1992, we have Poison Ivy and Basic Instinct. Neither of these films offer any kind of healthy sapphic representation and instead reinforce negative stereotypes. In fact, these films both have a lot in common with portraying their sapphic characters as psychotic, immoral types who are either killed off or specifically kept alive to service male sexuality. However, I've included them on the list because they are both a prime example of the exploitation of sapphic intimacy to appeal to the male gaze, and an example of the association between lesbianism and depravity that was so prevalent in cinema during this time. In 1993, we have The Three of Hearts, a film about a lesbian whose bisexual girlfriend walks out on her, so she hires a male escort to seduce and abandon that girlfriend in the hope she will then hate men so much she'll come back to her. Well, this film is written and directed by men, which, going by the synopsis, is probably a surprise to precisely no one. And it's probably also not a surprise to anyone that this film manages to be offensive to lesbians, bisexuals, and straight people, which is quite the accomplishment. There's not much to be said about this film other than it's a hollow, misguided attempt at a zesty romantic comedy. However, the relaxed approach to sexuality within the film, as purely just another aspect of the characters, does redeem it slightly, and ultimately it's still an addition to the lesbian cinematic landscape of the 90s. Also, you may recognise a young Kelly Lynch in this film, who went on to play the character of Ivan in The L Word. And speaking of The L Word, get used to actors from that show cropping up on this list. Eileen Shaken was clearly partial to a bit of 90s lesbian cinema. It's almost like she's a lesbian. Then in 1994, we have Sister My Sister, Heavenly Creatures, and Go Fish. Ah yes, the year of true crime lesbian cinematic offerings. Sister My Sister is based on a true crime story about two sisters who worked as maids and not only became lovers, but also murdered their employer. Whilst the portrayal of lesbian incest doesn't really bring much to the table in terms of positive representation, once again, it's another example of the intertwining of lesbianism with depravity in 90s cinema. Heavenly Creatures is also a film based on a true crime story. So in terms of representation, again, it's yet another film that associates lesbianism with immorality. That said, the lesbianism in this film is not exploitative or necessarily shown in a depraved light. The relationship itself is actually portrayed in a sympathetic light, particularly within the context of the time this film is set in. And whilst the negative associations with lesbianism are very much there, it still portrays a crime and a relationship that is really quite shocking and sensitive in a respectful way. As a fun fact, Heavenly Creatures was Kate Winslet's film debut, and of course, she then went on to star in the highest grossing film of the 90s, Titanic. So that's just a fun 90s connection there. Then we have Go Fish, which is a Rose Trochet directed independent piece of cinema. And of course, Rose Trochet is a name that might be familiar to some lesbians watching this, as she went on to work on The L Word. Go Fish is one of the better examples of lesbian cinema from the 90s, as it offered positive, diverse and authentic lesbian representation. And it also did relatively well at the box office, gaining recognition and showing that a healthy portrayal of lesbianism was in fact marketable to audiences, which positively contributed to the changing landscape of lesbian cinema in terms of increasing financial incentive to support authentic production. Then in 1995, we have The Incredibly True Adventure of Two Girls in Love and Higher Learning. The Incredibly True Adventure of Two Girls in Love is an independent film starring a young Laurel Holloman, who you may recognise as Tina from The L Word. And this film is possibly one of the most refreshing pieces of cinema to come out of the 90s. Not only does it offer authentic lesbian representation, but it also gives its lesbian couple a happy ending, which was still extremely rare in lesbian cinema in the mid-90s. The Incredibly True Adventure of Two Girls in Love is just an incredible production on so many levels. And then we have Higher Learning, which is not strictly a lesbian film. However, I've included it because it does have both a bisexual and a lesbian character who become involved with one another. Higher Learning isn't explicitly exploitative of lesbianism. In fact, the lesbian love scene in this film actually ended up being cut out, but the sapphic elements are very much distorted through a male lens. And there is the suggestion that lesbianism is a result of women being traumatized by men or being anti-men, which is a common misconception. However, the film is still a relevant addition to the list in terms of its lesbian representation. Also, Jennifer Connelly playing a lesbian is 95% of my dreams come true. The other 5% would be to adopt a giant talking cat. Then in 1996, we have Bound, The Watermelon Woman, and Set It Off. Oh, this was a good year. The lesbians ate well in 1996. They did. They didn't have any rights, but goddamn, if they didn't have some good films to watch whilst being oppressed. Bound, starring Jennifer Tilly and Gina Gershon, being one of the most iconic lesbian films to come out of the 90s. And although it didn't do well at the box office, it eventually became a cult classic. Now, I think there's a valid argument about Bound containing elements of exploitation, but in fact, its approach to lesbianism was unique for a film with male directors. For a start, the Wachowski brothers ended up hiring a feminist sex coach for the lesbian scenes, which made a notable difference to the intimacy in the film. And they did also give Corky and Violet a happy ending, which, like I said, was still scarce in lesbian cinema in the mid-90s. So I would argue that the film leans more towards a positive piece of representation as opposed to a purely exploitative production. And Bound really is just a fantastic piece of cinema. The Watermelon Woman, as I've already discussed, was a groundbreaking film in terms of black lesbian representation. And it was also a landmark of intersectionality in lesbian cinema that brought something fresh, raw, and educational to the cinematic landscape. The Watermelon Woman essentially put black lesbian cinema on the map. And then we have Set It Off. Now, Set It Off is an interesting addition because whilst it's not a lesbian film and it has a male director, it does offer refreshing lesbian representation in the form of Cleo, a lesbian character played by Queen Latifah. Cleo is refreshing as a lesbian character because she's not defined by her sexuality, and her being a lesbian is completely normalised in the film. So whilst the character does end up being killed off, I still think the portrayal of lesbianism in Set It Off is refreshing, especially for the 90s. Then in 1997, we have All Over Me, starring a young Leisha Haley, who you might recognise as Alice from the L Word. Like I said, there's a lot of L Word ladies up in this joint. Now, All Over Me is not an exclusively lesbian film, however it does portray a lesbian relationship and one that has a happy ending, which, like I said, was sacred in this period. All Over Me is a touching coming-of-age piece which explores homophobia, friendship dynamics and sexuality. Whilst it's not necessarily groundbreaking, it is an interesting and positive addition to 90s lesbian cinema. Then in 1998 we have Gia, Wild Things, Show Me Love, and Your Friends and Neighbours. Now, the lesbian representation in Gia is multifaceted. On the one hand, it's unapologetic and overt, which is refreshing, yet on the other hand, it does also reinforce the tragic lesbian stereotype. However, this film is based on the real life of supermodel Gia Karanji, who did unfortunately have a very tragic life. So much in the same way as Heavenly Creatures, it's not a film which offers strictly positive representation, but it does portray lesbianism in a sympathetic light. And the tragic elements of the film unfortunately reflect the reality of Gia's life. But on the bright side, Angelina Jolie. Wild Things is a film which, much in the same vein as Basic Instinct, utilises sapphic intimacy and bisexuality for the male gaze. And this film is of course mostly remembered for the famous kiss between Neve Campbell and Denise Richard. And yes, it is a softcore spectacle, but it's a self-aware one, and whilst it's another example of exploitation, at least it owns up to it. Speaking of the male gaze, we then have the film Show Me Love. Now, this production was fairly successful in the 90s and it is critically acclaimed. The film centres around two teenage girls who fall in love and all the trials and tribulations that come with teenagers discovering their sexuality. However, there's no way I would describe this film as authentic or one of the better lesbian films of the 90s, as some people claim it to be. Even if this film doesn't seem obviously exploitative, it's a quote-unquote lesbian film that's very anchored to male sexuality, which a lot of people don't acknowledge about this film. We're shown young teenage girls navigating their sexuality through the lens of a grown man, which ultimately, even if the technical aspects of the filmmaking make it seem more intelligent than your average cheap exploitative flick, It's still a, I should say, questionable product of the male gaze, just in slightly more careful packaging. Show Me Love is certainly not the worst lesbian film to come out of the 90s, but it's certainly not the best either. And then we have Your Friends and Neighbours, which is not exactly a lesbian film, however, it's included on this list for its portrayal of a sapphic relationship and brief show of intimacy within that relationship. The lesbianism in Your Friends and Neighbours is not necessarily exploitative, but nor is it of any real substance. Rather, it's included as a spicy side dish to all of the heterosexual shenanigans. And really, I would describe it as beige representation in that it's neither positive nor negative, but it is appreciated by me for Catherine Keener purposes, at the very least. Then in 1999, we have Being John Malkovich, But I'm a Cheerleader, Better Than Chocolate, and Amy and Jaguar. Being John Malkovich is included on this list because whilst it's not strictly a lesbian film, it does feature a sapphic couple, Maxine and Lottie, played by Catherine Keener and Cameron Diaz, who, despite being separated for most of the film, do have a happy ending. Being John Malkovich is much more subtle in terms of its sapphic representation, so it often goes under the radar. But when the film does focus on their relationship, it's very touching, if not a little confusing at times. And it's ultimately supportive. And once again, it is appreciated by me for Catherine Keener purposes. Then we have But I'm a Cheerleader, which of course is absolutely one of the most iconic lesbian films of not only the 90s, but of all time. And there's not much this film doesn't explore. Sexuality, gender roles, conversion therapy, and navigating a first love within all of that. This film really stands out against the majority of lesbian films produced in the 90s for its light-hearted comedic tone, and of course its happy ending. But I'm a Cheerleader is just a joy to watch and really highlights the absurdity of homophobia and gender roles. Next is Better Than Chocolate, a film which a lot of people have polarizing opinions on, but in terms of what it brings to the lesbian cinematic table, the positives outweigh the negatives. The film does focus on a lesbian relationship, and it offers authentic and creative portrayals of lesbian intimacy. In fact, this film is most famous for its sapphic artistic flair, but it also explores how family dynamics can impact lesbian relationships. Whilst the film isn't without its faults and a little heavy-handed with some of its messaging, for the most part it means well, and it's certainly not the worst addition to lesbian cinema in the 90s. And finally, we have Amy and Jaguar, an incredibly important piece of lesbian cinema based on the book of the same name, which entails the story of a love affair between a Jewish woman and a Nazi officer's wife in 1940s Germany. This film is incredibly important in terms of its exploration of the intersection between Judaism and lesbianism and how lesbian Jewish women navigated that intersection within Nazi Germany. It's a valuable piece of cinema and contribution to women's history, and in terms of representation, the film portrays a beautiful sapphic love story which took place in such a vulnerable time. And the tragic elements of it are an unfortunate reality of the horrific landscape in which this love unfolds. I think this film is not only unique in its portrayal of lesbianism due to the intersectional aspects, but also in its portrayal of the brief moments of love and joy that these women had in a time which was dominated by fear and terror, making it an exceptionally valuable piece of lesbian cinema. And there we have it. From this list, we can see the gradual decline of lesbianism exclusively intertwined with tragedy and immorality in cinema, and in its place a rise in much more positive, intersectional, educational, and uplifting portrayals of lesbianism, helping to diminish the negative connotations and prejudices which had dominated people's perceptions of lesbian relationships for so long. And this rise both shaped and mirrored society's attitudes towards homosexuality in the 90s, making it a defining decade for lesbian cinema. So from looking back at the on-screen lesbian representation in the 90s, we can clearly see an increase in lesbian visibility within media from the beginning of the decade right through to the end of it. And as a result of the increase in positive representation, there came a gradual positive change in the overarching public perception of lesbianism. There's no question that lesbians having a platform on which to voice their own experiences and narratives undid a lot of the negative and harmful prejudices that had been created and pushed by governments and various groups about lesbians and same-sex relationships in its absence. This gradual increase in social acceptance also paved the way for the progression of gay and lesbian legal rights not long after the 90s ended, which further highlights the magnitude of the impact that the gay boom of the 90s had on society. But what happened after the 90s is for another video and not this one. Yes. Never this one. So yes, the increase in lesbian media and intersectionality within that media makes the 90s a defining decade for lesbianism. And it's easy to see why this decade is often referred to as the gay boom. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any thoughts or comments that you'd like to add, feel free to leave them down in the comments section below. Sometimes I read them, sometimes I don't. If you want to support lesbian content from somebody created in the 90s in the biblical way, I wish I was dropped off by a stork. I really do. And you want to support women's voices, come and join the Sapphic Underground Club. Just come and join it. It's pretty much a monthly tip and it supports the work I do here. Don't be the kid that leaves me in a care home, okay? Don't forget to subscribe for instant disappointment and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.